Has our Bible been corrupted? What's up, church fam? I hope you're having a blessed day. And even if you're not church fam, welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here. I hope you enjoy the video. So if you never dove into the history of the Bible or did any kind of research to find how the Bible is reliable, then you might get confused when you hear things like this.
This book is based on some of the writings that are based on some of the writings of some of the writings of some of the writings that might have been the followers of Jesus, but it's definitely been corrupted.
Or this.
In this video, I will present to you evidences that the Bible has been corrupted throughout history, and I rely on unbiased sources, and these sources are Christian scholars.
Especially when they have British accents and sound real sophisticated like this.
The point is that, quite frankly, we have weak evidence of Christianity, and the preservation mechanism of Christianity has failed, and there's no doubt about that, according to the consensus of all scholars.
According to the consensus of all scholars, isn't this the guy that God Logic won a debate over and debunked his whole Islam theology right in front of him on his own channel? And then he sued God Logic, hoping to suppress the actual video footage of the debate? Well, Mr. Hijab, today I have for you a scholar. Mr. Wess Huff, can you please stand up? For those who don't know, Wess Huff holds a master's in theological studies and is on his way to earn a PhD in New Testament studies and Christian origins. This is the type of stuff that he's been studying, probably has put in thousands upon thousands of hours, numerous days and nights studying this exact topic. So we're going to get into a video he posted, and this is probably a few years back. And from since then, he's had multiple videos discussing the topic of the reliability of the Bible, but we're going to check this one out. So let's get straight into it.
Here this morning to share with you about my favorite book, the Bible. I don't know if you've heard about it or not. And one of the reasons it's my favorite book is simply because I call myself a Christian. I call myself a Christian, but where I get that identity as aligning myself with Christ, where I get that from is the Bible. And there are a number of objections that are raised against the trustworthiness, the reliability, the sufficiency of Scripture, of the Bible. Because I don't know if you've thought about this, but if you take Christ out of Christian, all you're left with is Ian. And Ian's a great guy, but he's not going to save you from your sins. And so we need to make sure that when we're reading the Scriptures, both the Old and the New Testaments, what it says about this Jesus guy is correct. But this is often complicated because the Bible isn't one book as much as it's 66 books. 66 books written over a period of about 1,600 years from 40 different authors on 3 different continents in 3 major languages. 2 major languages, Greek and Hebrew, and then 1 minor language, Aramaic. So we're not dealing with necessarily one book, as we're dealing with a mini library of books. And there are all sorts of other things we could say about the Bible, philosophically, historically, theologically. But what I want to talk about with you this morning is this topic that I've titled Copies of Copies. Do we have what the original authors wrote? Because the latest book, the closest book in the Bible that was written in proximity to us, was still almost 2,000 years old. So how do we know that that hasn't been tampered with? How do we know that it hasn't been changed? How do we know that objections like this aren't true?
All the things that are supposed to take place in the future are already. How all the prophecies, how completely antiquated they are, because when the Bible was written and then rewritten and then edited and then re-edited and then translated from dead languages and then retranslated and then re-edited and then re-edited and then retranslated and then given to kings for them to take their favorite parts out and then re-edited and retranslated and then re-edited and then given to the Pope for him to approve and then retranslated, then rewritten, then rewritten, re-edited, retranslated, re-edited again, all based on stories that were told orally 30 to 90 years after they happened to people who didn't know how to write. So, I guess what I'm saying is the Bible is literally the world's oldest game of telephone.
I don't know if you
I mean, for the sake of telling a joke, okay, you can see how that's probably funny, but people use this excuse a lot. They say the Bible has been translated over and over and over and over. It's impossible to have the original text. It's impossible to have that, right? But he'll explain this in a little bit. But think about this. If I tell somebody, if I give them a sentence in English and they tell different people, let's say 10 people down the line, one person, the next person speaks French, then the next person speaks Spanish, the next person speaks Chinese, and each language is different. By the time it gets to the 10th person, will it be different? Yes, it may or not be, right? But what if that 10 person, let's say he speaks Russian. Let's say he speaks Russian. Couldn't he just translate that sentence straight from the source, from me, English, straight to him, Russian, and skip all those languages in between? And that's kind of the point he's going to make. Yes, a lot of people say, you know, stuff, it's been lost in translation all these years, all these languages, different dialects, stuff has been lost in translation. But that's not the Bible that we have today. The Bible that we have today, it's translated from the oldest text that we have, right? So they're not translating it from the last translation, and that one was translated from the last translation. No, why would we do that, right? The Bible's translated from the oldest text that we have. And then years pass, we end up finding even older texts, and those texts verify the text that we have today. So a lot of people don't get that, because it's something I used to believe. I used to say when I was younger, you know, how can the Bible be true if it's been translated over time? It's been lost in translation. But as soon as you do any type of digging, any type of researching, you find out that this is just not true.
Heard that objection before? I do. I hear it quite a bit in my work, in my academic work. I'm doing my PhD at the University of Toronto in the area of the history of the Bible. Don't let that intimidate you. PhD stands for permanent head damage. You go to school long enough, they give you a piece of paper, they say, this guy, he needs to just get a life. So let's give him a piece of paper and get him out of here. You might recognize David Cross of comedian fame, and he raises that objection. It's an objection that's a common one. In fact, it's not just David Cross, it's individuals like Joe Rogan who continually repeat this kind of narrative of the telephone game about the history of the Bible. Even that scholarly piece of work known as the Da Vinci Code, you might be thinking it's a piece of something, I wouldn't say scholarly, but it says the Bible has evolved through countless translations, editions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. That's kind of the narrative that's communicated when we talk to people who are skeptical about the Bible. Maybe you even have your own skeptical views of the Bible itself. And so when you talk to people who hold these point of views, and I've talked to dozens and dozens, if you push into this objection that David Cross and others raise, often what they communicate is something like this. They'll grant maybe that a person named Jesus actually existed and that he did have some sort of a message. And maybe that was written in, argument's sake, say that he spoke in Aramaic, which would be true. That is the language that Jesus spoke most of the time. And so if his immediate followers took what Jesus wrote and he wrote them down, they wrote it down in Greek. This is what we have, the original copies of what we call the New Testament, the Gospels, those biographies of Jesus' life were written down in Greek. But here's where it goes wrong. They say, well, you know, people, as time goes on, they're no longer speaking languages. They're no longer reading languages like Greek. They're reading languages like Latin. And so they take those Greek copies, they translate them into Latin, and they get rid of the Greek copies. They're old, dusty, nobody's using them anyways. And then more time goes on and people aren't speaking Latin anymore, they're speaking languages like Old German. And so they take those Latin copies, they translate them into the German, they get rid of the Latin copies. And this goes on for a number of different languages until eventually you get to what we have as our modern English translations. And so in that sense, what they're thinking of is that you have a translation of a translation of a translation. The problem is that is not how you got your Bible. If you are holding a modern English translation of the Bible, it is not a translation of previous languages all the way up, a translation of a translation of a translation. When you hold a Bible, it's translated from those original languages that I referred to before. It's translated directly from the Hebrew and the Greek, and actually translation committees, these groups of scholars and academics who get together to translate the Bible and make it understandable in your language, in my language, they actually take into consideration how previous translations rendered certain things, but they're not translating from those previous languages, they're translating from the original languages and seeing how throughout history different individuals and groups have rendered those words in previous or different languages. This is a confusion of translation versus transmission. Translation is going through one language into another. Transmission is the long history of how we go from texts written in ancient languages 2,000 years ago to today. They're confusing that. They're confusing categories. Not only that, but what David Cross and others communicate with the telephone game is a single line of transmission. If you've never played the telephone game, it starts with me having a particular message. I whisper that into the person over there's ear, and they whisper into the next person's ear. And this goes down the line through all the pews until we get to the very back, and then we get that person at the very back to relay the message that they were whispered to. And of course, it's broken. I mean, this is why it's called broken telephone. It's messed up because of the rules of the game. It's a single person whispering into a single person's ear. You have to whisper. You can't say it twice. There are rules like this. But is that really what we have with the Bible? David Cross and Joe Rogan would say so. But if you look at the history of the Bible, what you find is that there were multiple authors writing at multiple times in multiple locations to multiple audiences who themselves were in multiple different locations. So it's not a single line of transmission, it's multiple lines of transmission injected with steroids. Why? Because not only do you have the original authors write.
I mean, like you said, we have multiple lines of transmissions because you have multiple authors that are taking these accounts and writing these books. And it's happening over, a long period of time. It's not just one set time where the Bible was written, right? It wasn't our 66 books were written on this day, and from this day it starts. No, it was over about, I think, roughly 1,600 years. You have multiple authors that are writing these books, right? And those books down the line, they're getting translated. But each time it gets translated, they're not erasing the older translation. They're not taking that old translation, translate it into a new language, and then just erase everything before that. No, I mean, that all stays there. But when they go down the line, they go back to the source. They translate from the source, and then they take into account the translations in between to see how that has helped translations as they evolved. But ultimately, they're translating from the original text.
Different times to different places, to different people in different locations. But then you have scribes who are likewise copying in different locations, writing to different audiences at different times who are themselves in different locations. And if we look at the history of this, between the 1st century when the New Testament was written and the 4th century, you have copies of both the Old and the New Testaments being copied and spread around all over the ancient world, so that by the time you get to the 4th century, you have hundreds, if not a few thousand, copies of what we would call the books of the Bible. They were independent at that time. They eventually got stuck into one volume, like we think of a Bible today. But copies of the Gospels, of the Acts, of the Psalms, of the prophets, floating around the ancient world, so that within a few decades and centuries, you have copies up into Europe, into Asia, and into North Africa, which means that no one person or no one group could have controlled the text at any one point in time. Why? Because if what David Cross said was correct, if you had popes and you had kings and you had scribes who wanted to insert things into the Bible, and they're in Turkey, what are they going to do with all the copies that are in North Africa? What are they going to do with all the copies that are into Central Europe? Well, they'd have to track them down and also alter them. But that would have been impossible. And so because of the history of the Bible, what's called the transmission, no one group or one person could have controlled the text at any one point in time. The objection for the translation doesn't work when we actually look at how we got the Bible. And
Just wanted to say this real quick. And that's what he's saying right now is designed by God, right? How it was made this way, that nobody could have corrupted it. It wasn't owned by just one group of people And that's the way it was translated down. No, the word instantly started getting spread around the world. And that you have to look and see that that was designed by God. You know, in the book of Psalms, it says, I don't know where, I forget which verse in Psalms, but it says, God, the Lord's word is fixed forever. And then in Matthew chapter 24, verse 35, Jesus tells his disciples, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will endure forever. So God will preserve his word, right? God will preserve his word. If he's a holy God, the creator of all, I mean, you think he's going to let his word get lost in translation? No, it's the living word. That's why, that's one of the reasons why we trust it, right? That's why we trust it. We go on faith, but there's actual factual evidence that proves it also.
The objection that people inserted things in the Bible that they wanted to or took things out also doesn't pan out when we look at how we got the history of the Bible. And not only that, but you might be thinking, okay, we're 2,000 years removed from the most recent books. We're even a few thousand years more removed from, say, some of the books in the Old Testament. So as time goes on, we're obviously getting farther away from the text, right? In one sense, of course. But in another sense, as time goes on, we're not necessarily getting farther from the original text. We're actually getting closer. What do I mean by that? Well, let me pick on the King James Bible for a second. The beloved King James Bible was translated between the years of 1604 and 1611. And it was translated not from manuscripts, those handwritten copies, but from printed editions of the Hebrew Old and Greek New Testaments. And the main printed editions that the King James translators use were based themselves on about 31 manuscripts. I'm talking about the New Testament here. Of the New Testament, the King James translators had 7 printed editions of the Greek New Testament, and those were based on approximately 31 manuscripts. Now, we have today 27 of those 31 manuscripts in our possession. We can go and we can look at them. But we also have 5,000 plus more manuscripts. If you skip ahead to 2023 from 1611, when the King James translation was published, we have a greater body of evidence that leads us back to the New Testament text and the Old Testament text. Because the earliest manuscript of those 31 that the King James translators had as their kind of underlying base text, the oldest of which was from the 11th century. Today, we have copies that go back to the 2nd century. So as time goes on, as we stick shovels in the ground and
I know a lot of King James only people they're not gonna like that part, but I mean what he's saying is true, right? So if you think about it, during the time the King James Bible was translated, you know, they had a certain amount of books that went back to a certain period of time. Now with these modern translations we've found even older copies than they had at the time the King James Bible was translated. So, I mean, that's just more evidence right there, right? And that goes to show people, when people say, you know, you got to read only the King James Bible, right? Which King James is it's a good version. I have the King James Bible also. I use that book also. But these newer versions, they're translated from even older manuscripts than what the King James was, because that's what they had at the time, right? So, you know, it just goes to show you that how people say, you know, stuff's been translated, it's been lost in translation, it's been lost in time. It's just not true. The video goes on longer. I'm going to stop right there. I'll put the link of the full video down in the description so you can check it out, because he makes a lot of other points, and I mean, they're all really good. He gives you a lot of facts and just shows you and proves that the Bible is to be taken as a reliable document. If you think about Alexander the Great, you know, all his writings, all the writings about him were written way after, centuries after. I think like 400 years after his death, people started writing about Alexander the Great, right? And the earliest copies that we have were only 90 years after the death of Jesus. So when you think about that, I mean, that's well within a generation, maybe just a little bit over a generation, but you would have had people that were alive at the time of the disciples, right? You would have had people that learned off of the disciples. So it's not that far out, right? But people they want to have this real firm and real strict criticism when it comes to criticizing the Bible. But they don't do that when it's other texts, when we're using other historical texts, historical textbooks, and different biographies throughout history. They don't apply that same criticism to those as they do with the Bible. So I want to hear what you guys thought about the video. Go ahead, leave a comment down below. Let me know what y'all think. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed and you're not a subscriber, I hope that you will be. If you've been enjoying these videos, pray for me. I'll be praying for y'all. I love y'all. I'm out.